theater at its best is a liberating experience. It's a liminal experience that takes you, when it's done well, or sometimes when it's done poorly, depending on how it's done, takes you out of your everyday experience and puts you into a singular group shared experience that is both of the moment and beyond the moment. And, nothing does that better than absurdity.
In this episode, Bradley McDevitt takes us on a journey from childhood mimicry to life-changing moments in physical theater. He's spent decades exploring how performance can be a liberating, almost spiritual experience. Bradley McDevitt.
The Trickster archetype contains all of the other archetypes. It has that Ouroboros, snake eating its own tail complexity. The Trickster both mocks humanity, plays at being human, and is other. This time that we're in is very much a Trickster moment.
Welcome back to The Boundless Body. So check this out. 63.5% of you who are regular listeners haven't subscribed yet to the show. So please take a moment. It'll be really helpful to click subscribe. It's free of charge. It will really help us out. In turn, we'll help you out by bringing you better and better content. Along those lines, send us an email with your feedback, boundlessbodypod@gmail.com. Send us your feedback about how you think we can do better. Give us questions to address on the show, interviewees you'd like us to interview. It'd be super helpful. Okay. Let's be a community. Okay. Today on The Boundless Body, we have Bradley McDevitt. Thank you so much, Bradley, for joining us.
Well, you're very welcome. I'm glad to be here.
Cool. So I'm going to just read out your bio here and then we'll see where the spirit takes us. Yeah. So Bradley McDevitt began his professional journey in the world of theater, where he spent over 2 decades as a creator and performer, mastering physical theater techniques, including mask work, mime, movement, and personal clown. This deep immersion in the art of storytelling, character development, and emotional intelligence honed his ability to connect with audiences and individuals, and to navigate the complexities of human experience through creative expression. Today, as an ICF certified core practitioner of presence-based coaching and an adjunct professor at Pacifica Graduate Institute, he integrates his background in depth psychology and creativity with cutting-edge leadership development practices. So Bradley is in the business of training leaders, and I'm really interested in discussing, the powers of working with self-expression and, nurturing a body's ability to express the potencies of life. So welcome, Bradley. I'm really interested in your work with clown in particular, because I have a love for clowning. I also was a trained psychodramatist. So this is where I fell in love with the orientation to actively cultivating spontaneity. And I believe it's kind of essential in setting a person free from the rules of culture and so on. So can you tell us a little bit about your journey with theater and with mime and, kind of like your origin story as a person that nurtures self-expression?
Sure. Well, and again, thanks for having me here, Brian. It's a real pleasure. And I've always been fascinated by performance. Even as a young kid, I was a mimic and a clown and really enjoyed grabbing the spotlight and had a proclivity for especially voices. I could mimic the voices of other kids to the point where their parents couldn't tell the difference, and sort of naturally inhabited the Trickster at a pretty early age. In fact, my middle name is the anglicized version of the word Dionysus. It's Dennis. I didn't find that out until I was knee-deep in symbolism and mythology studies and looked for the actual derivation of my full name. And there it was in plain sight. So it makes complete sense in retrospect that I would have been drawn to the liminal space of the stage and also clowning. So I've been involved in theater my whole life. I wouldn't call myself a theater kid. I was pretty resistant, especially to, I would say, musicals and sort of the staid traditional versions that you would find in schooling and that sort of thing. But really found myself gravitating towards movement and dance, especially. And I had a singular experience when I was in my early 20s. I had a burst appendix and I was septic for 3 days. And after a very complicated and near-death surgery, was retreating at my parents' house and convalescing, and happened upon a videotape, I'm dating myself a little bit, at the time, of Tom Stoppard's cinematic version of the play Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. And so it's Hamlet told from the perspective of two of the lesser known characters, Hamlet's erstwhile friends from college, as they bumble along through sort of the backstage of the set of Hamlet. And in one of the earliest scenes, they're camping by the side of the road, and the player king and the players come through and happen upon Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. And the player king was played to great fanfare by Richard Dreyfuss. And so he stops the cart and sees the two of them as an audience. And essentially the cart opens up, the sides unfold and become a stage, and they jump down, and there are some amazing Czech performers who were brought in for this movie production. And they proceed to do a complete physical theater retelling of some show. And it was so engaging. Not only did they do all of the parts, all of the music, all of the sound effects, there was a real visceral, embodied aspect to the performance that I'd never seen before. And at that moment, recuperating from this life near-death experience, I thought, that's what I want to do. And then went to basically write an entrance essay for an application to schools, saying that I wanted to either create or join a physical theater company that toured the world, did original work, and worked with kids. That I had this real strong vision of that. And I ended up going to the Evergreen State College in the early 90s, in 92. And in the beginning of my third year there, a physical theater company came and stayed in residence at the college, did original work, European style based work, and traveled the world, toured the world, and worked with kids. And so they checked all the boxes. And so I essentially made it impossible for them to say no to me, first as an intern, and then I joined them as a full-time member and worked with them for the better part of a decade and toured the world and created original physical work. Among those things was the study of personal clown, buffoon theater, contact improv, and a whole host of other things. So very much rooted in a European style physical theater, which is based in mime, Delacroix, commedia dell'arte, these sorts of ancient forms. And the personal clown in particular really spoke to me. The clown is basically just a clown nose, the world's smallest mask, and just brings into really sharp focus, at least in my experience, the whole sort of contradiction of the trickster's embodiment in clown, which is this connection with the sacred in this vertical axis, combined with the horizontal axis of our sort of base human experience. And at that intersection is where the clown lives, of both the sacred and the profane. And the level of vulnerability, openness that performance style requires is I think of it as a spiritual path, a spiritual experience in many ways. And that especially is how it communicates and connects with the audience specifically, but humanity more broadly. And as I'm sure you're aware in your practice, both in the arts as well as in professional practice, that connection to humanity and sort of existence as a laboratory for performance and for human study really is what cemented that as a a calling as well as, I would say, a spiritual practice.
Beautiful. So one of the things that I am amused by and has been my muse is what I've been calling the healing power of absurdity. And I'm wondering if you could scan your memory banks of being with this troupe over a decade and share with the audience a healing moment of absurdity where these embodied figures, you being one of them, maybe it's a gesture of vulnerability, maybe it's a gesture of hilarity, but if you could just, kind of bring us into a moment.
Yeah. Several come to mind, but I would say one of the strongest came from a gig we had. We were hired by the Bumbershoot Festival. I would say this was probably 1997, 98, something like that, before the flash mob phenomenon. And we were hired to create some sort of recurring events so they take over the Seattle Center, which is this large public forum, for a week. And there's performances and musicians, and it's very much like a festival kind of ground. And so we created what we called the SPILT project, was the Spontaneous Imagination Liberation Theater. And we worked with a group of about 30 performers and volunteers and created these sort of rough forms, very much in the style of Augusto Boal's guerrilla theater. Some of them were directly inspired by that, where we would meet anonymously in and amongst a crowd at a certain appointed time and place. So we were dressed normally, undifferentiated from the rest of the fairgoers. And at a certain point on our synchronized watches, we would all start doing some performative act. And the one that really jumps out to me was this kind of grassy bank next to the big fountain. And all of us, over the course of 5 or 10 minutes, would quietly, go and place ourselves amongst other people who were sitting on the grassy knoll, just hanging out, enjoying the sunshine, reading, listening to music, that sort of thing. And all of us had a small newspaper or something tucked under our arm, and we sat. And then as the clock struck the appointed moment, we all unfurled our newspapers and at random just picked a story or an article in the paper and started reading sort of sotto voce. And over the course of about a minute, went from whispering, reading the article aloud, to full-blown shouting, reading it at top volume. And it was a completely absurd moment. You can imagine 30 people reading a weather forecast or, a Hezbollah attack or, a recipe for Ann Lander's advice column. And then just crushing the paper up, tossing you over our shoulder, and then just dispersing. So those kinds of things, you see where the Spontaneous Imagination Liberation Theater title comes from. It's just like, what's going on? So this disjunct moment of absurdity. There was another one where we all had balloons, deflated balloons and rubber bands tied in our pockets. And there was a walkway. So we would just go kind of walk, and at the appointed moment would blow up the balloon, dispersed, you'd stop, blow up the balloon, tie the rubber band around it, and then stand still for about 30 seconds. And then we'd all just suddenly start banging the balloon and laughing maniacally around as people were walking. Suddenly they're looking around, what the hell is going on? And then just running around, letting the balloon fly off and then running away. And so those moments are just really stand out for me, because theater at its best is a liberating experience. It's a liminal experience that takes you, when it's done well, I believe, or sometimes when it's done poorly, depending on how it's done, takes you out of your everyday experience and puts you into a singular group shared experience that is both of the moment and beyond the moment. And nothing does that better than absurdity.
So you've said the word liminal twice now. I'm wondering if you could qualify that for the listeners in case they don't know that term.
Yeah, so the word liminal comes from limen, which is literally threshold. So it refers to the part of the door, the bottom of the door that is neither this room nor that. And you step over it in order to transition from one room or one space to another. And so liminal spaces are spaces between spaces. And in terms of performance, really refer to the state of being accessible only via ritual, only via performance, or really strong musical experiences. Things like shamanic interventions. One ritual that comes to mind is Haitian voodoo rituals, which are shared experiences mediated by music, rhythms, dancing, song, and everyone knows the lyrics to the songs, everyone knows the music, everyone knows that, let's say, this particular drum beat belongs to this particular god, or as they call him, Loa. And because of that participation, people are drawn into this space that is no longer mundane. It transforms into something else. It's this, I don't know if you're familiar with musical notation, this term fermata, which is sort of an extended pause between movements or between sections, that nobody's clapping during a fermata because they know that it's still part of the performance or part of the musical piece, but you're sort of suspended in this moment, this collective. And in theater, which is holds a direct lineage from the shaman or the shamanic process, is predicated on this liminality, on this suspension of disbelief, at least in the modern parlance, in the modern version of theater, which is we enter as audience and as performer into the same space that has agreed upon rules. The audience will sit here and be silent and observe, and the performers will come in and they will do Morning Becomes Electra or Hamlet or whatever the piece du jour is. The stage itself is a liminal space. There's a threshold, the edge between the audience and the performers. And that agreement consists of a boundary. It becomes a sacred space because of that agreement. And depending on the power of the performers and the willingness of the audience, that agreement can transcend the mundane experience and become something bigger and transformative. And the idea of liminality and the liminal space is that you enter as one thing and you leave as something else. And so one very Western example of that would be, like a Catholic Mass or a bris, where there is a literal as well as a figurative transformation that happens within the confines of a sacred ritual. In the case of a bris, there's literally a piece of the person cut off. And also in the figurative sense, in the minds of everyone who's participating, that person is now different. They have transformed into something else. And so they're treated as something else. That's the magic of theater. And it's more and more as the arts and theater in particular are marginalized in communities and in society, the less power it has for that kind of transformation, which to me is a real tragedy. And one of the reasons that I do the work that I do.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. There's this common phrase that's getting bandied about as a corrective to simple binary logic, either or logic. And that's the term, both and. People say, oh, it's a both and rather than an either nor. But I personally think that the liminal space is a both and a neither nor. such that we can say it's both sacred and profane. And it's kind of neither. It's in the middle. It's mobile. I personally think that the trickster archetype is the archetype of mobility itself, that it can't be pinned down to either sacred or profane. It's always on the move.
Yeah. I was just in a workshop with a colleague of mine, Carol Burbank, who's also faculty at Pacifica. And we were doing a workshop on the trickster, and she made the wonderful point, which I completely agree with, that speaks to what you just said, that the trickster archetype contains all of the other archetypes. There's a reason why the Fool in the tarot deck is first, and why it's not number one, it's number 0, right? It's because it has that Ouroboros, snake eating its own tail, complexity and wholeness to it, that the trickster both mocks humanity, plays at being human and is other, right? The hermaphrodite, the sacred, the hierophant, all of those archetypes are contained within it, and it precedes and precludes all of that knowledge and understanding, and also is the mirror for us. And I think one of the reasons why that phrase is bandied about is because this time that we're in is very much a trickster moment. One of my other colleagues calls it a kairos moment, which is this moment of potentiality, this moment of change, this positive renewal. Even though it's filled with strife and discord and disharmony, those are harbingers of positive transformation.
Yeah. Are you familiar with Victor Turner's distinction between the liminal and the liminoid?
I am. Remind me though of how he makes it, because I think it's liminal would be more like physical. Liminoid is more in the interiority, correct?
Yeah. So the way that he defined it is that liminoid operates like true liminal space. It has certain mobilities about it. It has deconstructive qualities. It's kind of a space outside of the mundane. So it kind of mimics the liminal, but it's not quite the liminal. We could see this in, for example, virtual space. I think virtual space in some sense is kind of a liminoid space. I mean, there isn't, leadership. There isn't, one of the distinctions that Robert Moore talks about in terms of his explanation of liminal versus liminoid is that one of the primary aspects of the liminal is you have some sort of ritual technology or ritual leadership. So you have somebody stewarding the boundary, somebody creating the boundary, somebody kind of like helping people to navigate coming in and going out. Yeah. And that is one of the things that is lacking. Like, for example, pilgrimage, he packages that as liminoid, because you don't have like an elder there or something like that. Usually you don't have an elder helping the pilgrim to kind of enter into the space and to exit the space. So it kind of packages that. But yeah, so, like drug use and things like that are often packaged, without leadership and support.
Sort of like accidental liminality.
Packages that. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
I
think it's a really interesting distinction. Yeah. And I think it's a good segue into your work with leadership. Like how does all this stuff, which is, it sounds, quite mystical. Like how are you packaging it for the leadership community and for people out there in consulting work, and people that are working in businesses and so on?
It's a hard sell to ask anyone with a C-suite title to move towards anything that's embodied or...
Yeah, Brad, just put on this clown nose and see what happens.
Exactly. Brene Brown has this great story where she's talking about how, leaders will come to her and say, we love your talk about, shame and healing and all this stuff, and we'd love for you to come talk to our company. She's like, great. And they say, but one thing, just please don't mention the word vulnerability, which is the entire point. And
the entire brain. Yeah, exactly.
so it is. It's a hard circle to square, as it were. And I find the quickest and easiest way to that is through science, is to talk about cognitive neuroscience, to talk about psychology. I'm particularly fond of the work of Dr. Ian McGilchrist, whose book, The Master and His Emissary, kind of, to me, was a groundbreaking, paradigm-shifting book, which really focuses in on the hemisphere hypothesis. Because ultimately, what we're talking about is how we attend to the world. And in McGilchrist's work, he basically posits that we don't have one brain with two halves, but rather we have two brains that talk occasionally, but that the corpus callosum, which is the sort of known as the information superhighway that connects the two hemispheres, he posits and points out is largely inhibitory, that it actually stops communication between the two halves. Because if there was a free exchange, we'd go crazy because our salience landscaping wouldn't know what to pick out. And so just like a quick primer overview of his hypothesis, and this is what I often will start my work with leadership to give this understanding, is that the left hemisphere, which has been dominant in our society for the last 300 years or so, and brought in by the Age of Reason and Cartesian common sense and all that, is a very literal fact-finding, fact-making hemisphere that is very good at categorizing, organizing, and needs to be certain. So the example that McGilchrist uses is, imagine that you're a bird at the edge of a field and you've got a pile of seeds and stones. So the left hemisphere is very good at literally grasping, right? Picking up, differentiating what's useful and what's not. You know, this is the hull of the seed. This is the meat. I need the meat for sustaining. It's good at differentiating. That's a stone. That's not. It's terrible at seeing the hawk on the other side of the field, or the snake behind you, or the other birds that are vying for your meal. So it lacks nuance. It lacks subtlety. It lacks large systems thinking. It has no sense of subtlety or irony or metaphor, you know. So when you were to ask someone with right hemisphere damage, say, you know, from a stroke, how did you sleep? They would say, on my side. There's no differentiation of meaning. And when you give that hemisphere the reins, as we've done in evidence-based practice, in scientific method, in seeing the world in terms of its concomitant parts and its utility, what you get is deforestation, climate change, polarization, tribalism. And the right hemisphere, by stark contrast, sees the big picture, sees the relationships between things, sees that the forest is not just lumber or firewood, but it's also a home. It's also a climate stabilizer. It also provides shade. It also, like, all of those intertwined systems are accessible to the right hemisphere. Just framing that understanding in a very specific and frankly scientific language instantly brings it home to them, because they suddenly see how they have preferenced one or the other in their work, in their leadership, and in maybe the company's hierarchical style, or how it moves through the world, how they work with their direct reports, how their teams are structured. And from there, once they see that, and the huge body of evidence that McGilchrist and others have brought to bear on this argument, they become much more willing to take the risk to try something that's a little more right hemisphere focused, which is where the embodiment comes in, which is where the movement, literal and figurative, between people One of the first exercises I do with small groups is literally just a walking exercise where we switch back and forth between interiority of focus and exteriority of focus. Because what the two hemispheres do is literally attend to the world in two very different ways. And the argument that McGilchrist puts forward, and I believe very, very strongly is true, is that attention is a creative act. And it is also a moral act. And that we are literally making the world depending on how we attend to it. So you can think of the example of waking up and, we say we're in a good mood or a bad mood, or we woke up on the right or the wrong side of the bed, completely changes our interactions. And that's predicated on how we choose to see the world. And oftentimes people feel very led by their feeling states or their emotional responses to things. And when we are able to take that moment and distance ourselves, I talk a lot about metacognition in theater and acting terms as the ability to sense intimately what's happening in our interiority, both physically, kinesthetically, proprioceptively, but also emotionally, so that we no longer react, we respond, we proact, that we can choose specifically both to be informed by what's happening inside, like, oh, wow, I have a really strong activation to what this person just said. My instinct is to punch him in the nose, but my response will be to nod my head and say, thank you for that. That's good for me to know. That has to be learned, right? That has to be enculturated. You have to work very hard to be able to differentiate yourself, capital S, from all of the different voices that are vying for attention inside you. And I find that and this is what Theater of Self, my work is based on, is learning the embodied techniques for enhanced metacognition, for enhanced interoception, for that flexibility and ability to both empathize and to hold space for yourself and for others simultaneously. That's when you start with the neuroscience, when you start with the facts of what the wetware is actually designed to do, then people are much, much more willing to jump into the experiment.
So how do you manage this systemic allergy towards vulnerability? Because a lot of these folks feel like they're going to become less effective if they become vulnerable.
Yeah. We address it in a couple different ways because what they're ultimately concerned about, especially I'm thinking in particular for leaders of companies or corporations, is they're worried about shareholders. They're worried about the bottom line. They're worried about the efficacy of their leadership as pertains to their end goals. But the paradigm in the culture is shifting and they are slow to react oftentimes. So when you put it in terms of, hey, if you're able to hold space for your employees who are changing, right? You no longer have the pensioned employee who gets the watch and retires has been a company person for their entire life. Now you have different generations who are specifically looking for different kinds of validation, who need different kinds of things, who don't have the same sort of work ethic. Not that they don't have a work ethic, it's just that they value and respond to different kinds of stimulus. And if you're not prepared to take advantage of that, and that might be the wrong term to use, but to understand and work within those confines, you're not going to have strong employees, right? You're going to have unincentivized workers. You're not going to be able to communicate your needs. They're not going to buy into them. And so they become less creative. They become less invigorated by your message, and they go elsewhere. But if you're able to both hold space for yourself, and oftentimes I'll use the language to just notice what you notice, right? To be able to use that metacognitive flexibility to really look specifically at what's showing up for you. And the body is the way that we most effectively handle that. Then you're able to hold space for someone else. But if you don't have that self-awareness and you're tethered to this way that you learned at Wharton Business School or at Duke Fuqua to progress, my way or the highway, that doesn't tend to work really well. And you have a lot of turnover, which leads to a lot more training, which leads to a lot more expense. So when you put it into those terms, they kind of go, okay, I get it. I'll give it a try. So that's sort of the entree to, maybe there's something to this improv, thinking on your feet. And in fact, a good friend of mine, Greg Hone, works at the Keenan Flagler Business School here in Chapel Hill at UNC, and he teaches improv for business students. And without fail, the majority of his students will reach out to him after they've entered the workforce and say, thank you. Your class was the single most important class that I had in the 2 or 3 years that I was in the business school, because it gives them the ability to stand and think actively on their feet in the midst of fight or flight, triggering responses. It gives them the ability to, in the improv world, we use the term yes and, which is an acceptance and a preparation and an offering. And that at any given moment in an improvisation on stage, you say yes. It doesn't matter what it is. If someone accidentally drops a glass, you say yes. And suddenly that's the scene. You don't say, oh, sorry, we'll clean that up and then we'll continue with what we were planning to do, because that's dead. It's dead from the get-go.
Such a powerful and simple practice.
Right. And that's just it. It's simple, it's uncomplicated, but it requires getting out of the way. It requires a measured ability to, in theater, we call it third eyeing yourself, which is sort of seeing, oh, wow, I'm doing a great job on stage, which in some cases is the death of the role, because you suddenly are pulled out of the lived experience of being the character that you're trying to portray. But in a very real sense, you have to have, I call it omnidirectional awareness, right? Because you have to know your lines. You have to know who your character is and how they perform, how they move, but you also have to make your mark. You also have to know where the light is. You also have to be able to relate to the other people on stage. And then there's the audience. You have to wait for their laughter to subside. You have to respond in the moment to what's happening. You have to be able to project. All of those things have to be tracked. So in some ways, that metacognition is still present. And the virtuosic F1 driver isn't thinking about all of those things. They've practiced so long that they instinctively turn the wheel. Well, the same thing is true with us. The first exercise that I just started describing earlier of just walking, I do that because if you try to sit and in a sort of typical meditation pose and I'm going to calm my body, I'm going to calm my mind, I'm going to see what's going on, the monkey mind gets in the way, right? It's like, oh, I've got emails I've got to attend to. What am I doing after this? Oh, I feel terrible about the argument that I just had with my wife. But the moment that you start walking, we are, for the most part, expert, virtuosic walkers. The body knows how to walk. And so suddenly the monkey mind is trying to attend to walking. And it occupies a large part of what's happening in the brain. And now the other parts of the brain can kind of follow along and go, oh, wow, yeah, I can start to pay attention to how my feet are hitting the floor or how my hips are moving. Oh, wow, I'm really holding my shoulders tightly. It gives us an immediate access to the body in a way that just sitting and trying to visualize oftentimes can be very fraught. So that was a long answer to a short question, but
it reminds me of this modern trickster figure that we have, Robin Williams, in this wonderful scene in Dead Poets Society where they're in the courtyard and he's getting the boys to just walk, but walk with variability, walk with mobility, loosen up the structures. Hey, let's loosen up the gridlock in the psyche here so it can make room for real spontaneity and expression.
Exactly. Yeah. And the first thing that he points out is that, oh, there it is. Everyone's in lockstep. Everyone's walking in the same step. And that's absolutely true. That happens. You'll notice in the exercise. So we first start with interior focus. Don't pay attention to anybody. Don't worry about what's happening in the space. Just focus on what's happening inside. How do you feel? What's going on? The moment I say shift to exterior focus, they speed up. And then when they shift back to interior focus, they slow down. The head goes down. And none of those things are instructed. It's just instinctive. It's just these patterns that we hold. But the moment you start to recognize, and that's often when we reflect after the exercise, that's often what people notice, because we do this often in groups with two groups. One will watch, observe, and the other will do. And so I ask the watchers, the audience, notice what you notice. And without fail, they say, number one, the tempo sped up when they would shift, or it would slow down when they went back inside. And if I'm working with someone remotely, it's hard to do these exercises in person. I can't be there in the room to help guide that, but I offer just a sort of a guided walking meditation where I ask them, they put me in their ears and have a recording where they go through this, and they're walking down the street. And it's in some cases a poor substitute, but they report an absolutely kind of revelatory experience in terms of, wow, I did not pay attention to how I shifted and my inability to hold myself and to be able to keep track of what's happening inside when my focus goes out, because that's the ultimate end of the exercise is, okay, now try to be aware of what's happening inside, every level of granular detail that you just accessed, and be accessible to your surroundings, situational awareness, the expressions of other people, the sounds that you hear, the temperature, like all of those things. That omnidirectional awareness is very challenging for anybody, but that's ultimately what then an actor is trying to achieve, is heightened ability to sense what's happening inside and heightened ability to sense what's happening outside at the same time, because that gives the full range of expression and mobility for anyone, whether an actor on stage is being and doing, which is the same thing that any of us are doing. So we're all actors, in roles, being and doing. So there's a very easy parallel there.
Doobie doobie doo.
Doobie doobie doo.
Doobie doobie doo. Hey, Bradley, do you have time for one more riff, or should we close? Yeah, Stanford Business School does spontaneity training as well, and which I think is just awesome and important. I was thinking that we could orient to close and like your final riff by sharing a quote from one of our mutual beloved authors, James Hillman, and just seeing, just kind of throwing that towards you as a stimulus and just seeing where you take it. It's by way of, what the trickster does, which is like a deconstruction. And I love how you've connected that with vulnerability. And Hillman's text right here really speaks to it. And I just want to see where you take it. Okay.
Yeah.
Healing begins when we move out of the audience and onto the stage of the psyche. Become characters in a fiction. And as the drama intensifies, the catharsis occurs. We are purged from attachments to literal destinies, find freedom in playing parts, partial, dismembered, Dionysian, never being whole, but participating in the whole that is a play. The self divided is precisely where the self is authentically located. Authenticity is the perpetual dismemberment of being and not being a self.
Hillman was a trickster, wasn't he? He loves to speak in riddles.
Exactly.
Well, the first thing that jumped out to me is actually a quote by Jung the quote about the symbolic life and how badly in need humans we are of the symbolic life, and that everyone feels a deep need to be connected to what he calls the divine drama, to be an actor in the divine drama of life. And that enactment is where individuation happens. It's the acceptance and the integration of all of the archetypes that we encounter and that we embody in our lives. And that rather than grabbing one mask or one persona after another, there is, and I think Hillman's quote speaks to this, both a differentiation and a grouping of those masks into one authentic, capital S, self that allows you to play all of those roles simultaneously and honestly, because ultimately that's what we're coming to, is how authenticity, I think, is overused in our society. And I think what we really mean when we say authenticity is honest truth. And I am someone who does believe in objective, capital T, truth, that there is such a thing, and that that's what the soul yearns for. And that it's a constant seeking, and that the only way we can even begin to know it is by holding our truth lightly while we try to perceive the truth of the other at the same time. There's a great story. It's a West African story where the trickster god Eshu he sees two farmers, and there's a path between the two fields, and they're working, and he says, I'm going to play a trick on them. And so he puts on a hat with black on one side and white on the other, and he puts on resplendent clothes and jewelry, and he just marches down the field. And the two farmers, of course, stand up and they see him and watch him as he passes, and they're both just in awe. And they come together on the road as he's going off into the distance, and one of them says, did you see that incredibly dressed guy with the black hat? And the other farmer says, well, I saw the incredibly dressed guy, but he was wearing a white hat, you idiot. And then they're arguing back and forth about the nature of reality. And then Eshu comes back and he says, I fooled with you. It's both. And I feel like that is the journey that Hillman is talking about, that's both what happens to us inside, is that hat keeps turning. And one moment we're caught by this feeling, one moment we're caught by this persona, one moment we're caught by this instinctive activation, and the other we're caught by someone else's contradiction or tribalist mentality or political differentiation. And that the only way to find that capital T truth is by holding your own lightly. And that's really the process of individuation, that it starts with us, and through doing that allows us the ability to do that with the world.
That's so beautiful. And I'm so glad that you invoked Eshu Alegba. There's this wonderful text called The Signifying Monkey. Have you ever run into it?
Yeah.
It's wonderful, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's just a wonderful text. And, Legba is really lifted up as this mobile trickster deity that is this archetype of mobility, that it's this floating signification. This is always on the move, and we can attach the meanings that we choose to make. And I really love this image of unity in multiplicity and multiplicity in unity, where there's a kind of coming together, but the coming together is a multiplicity and a mobility. And I'm reminded of like the harlequin's cloak.
Yes.
As an image for the self, that we just the bric-a-brac putting together a kind of chimera of, different animals and different intensities and different affects and different selves and different masks.
Well, to bring it home to the clown comes alive when it is simultaneously playing at being human and being human. and being spiritual, right? Because when we take ourselves too seriously, we're unable to see the larger context. There's a left and right hemisphere again. But that ability to laugh at ourselves, I mean, the clown lives in failure, right? And there's this great, I can't remember who said it. I think it's attributed to Anne Sexton, but that might be apocryphal. Ambition is the death of the poem. And I think that speaks so closely to the human condition. And that when the clown tries the ambition, there's failure after failure after failure. And it's the moment of release and letting go that success happens, that they succeed, almost as if by accident. And that speaks to the divine. That speaks to this sort of the intervention of letting go, that this larger force, whatever that is for us, playing a role in our lives, right?
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show, Bradley. Yeah. Is there anything that you'd like to pitch before we close?
Well, folks can find me. My company is carolinacommons.org. And, I'm a personal and professional development coach, and I'm always looking for opportunities to bring this work to other people. I have a podcast called The Quotidian, which hopefully you'll be on soon. I love talking about this stuff and bringing this perspective of the creative and the embodied to bear on our Kairos moment, our moment of change and our moment of need.
Well, thank you so much. Hope to see you again.
My pleasure. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you for listening to the Boundless Body Podcast. Please like us, share, subscribe, and until next time, stabilize, catalyze, and thrive.